Romancing Mr. Bridgerton. By Julia Quinn. April is nearly upon us, and with it a new social season here in London. Ambitious mamas can be found at dress shops all across town with their darling debutantes, eager to purchase that one magical evening gown that they simply know will mean the difference between marriage and spinsterhood. As for their prey, the determined bachelors, Mr. Colin Bridgerton once again tops the list of desirable husbands, even though he is not yet back from his recent trip abroad. He has no title, that is true, but he is in abundant possession of looks, fortune, and, as anyone who has ever spent even a minute in London knows, charm. But Mr. Bridgerton has reached the somewhat advanced age of 33 without ever showing an interest in any particular young lady. And there is little reason to anticipate that 1824 will be any different from 1823 in this respect. Perhaps the darling debutantes, and perhaps more importantly their ambitious mamas, would do well to look elsewhere. If Mr. Bridgerton is looking for a wife, he hides that desire well. On the other hand, is that not just the sort of challenge a debutante likes best? Prologue. On the 6th of April, in the year 1812, precisely 2 days before her 16th birthday, Penelope Featherington fell in love. It was, in a word, thrilling. The world shook. Her heart leaped. The moment was breathtaking. And, she was able to tell herself with some satisfaction, the man in question, one Colin Bridgerton, felt precisely the same way. Oh, not the love part. He certainly didn't fall in love with her in 1812, and not in 1813, 1814, 1815, or, oh, blast, not in all the years 1816 to 1822, either, and certainly not in 1823, when he was out of the country the whole time anyway. But his earth shook, his heart leaped, and Penelope knew without a shadow of a doubt that his breath was taken away as well. For a good 10 seconds. Falling off a horse tended to do that to a man. It happened thus. She'd been out for a walk in Hyde Park with her mother and 2 older sisters when she felt a thunderous rumbling under her feet, see above, the bit about the earth shaking. Her mother wasn't paying much attention to her, her mother rarely did, so Penelope slipped away for a moment to see what was about. The rest of the Featheringtons were in rapt conversation with Viscountess Bridgerton and her daughter Daphne, who had just begun her 2nd season in London, so they were pretending to ignore the rumbling. The Bridgertons were an important family indeed, and conversations with them were not to be ignored. As Penelope skirted around the edge of a particularly fat trunk tree, she saw 2 riders coming her way, galloping along heifer leather, or whatever expression people like to use for fools on horseback who care not for their safety and well-being. Penelope felt her heart quicken. It would have been difficult to maintain a sedate pulse as a witness to such excitement, and besides, this allowed her to say that her heart leaped when she fell in love. Then, in one of those inexplicable quirks of fate, the wind picked up quite suddenly and lifted her bonnet, which, much to her mother's chagrin, she had not tied properly since the ribbon chafed under her chin, straight into the air and, splat, right onto the face of one of the riders. Penelope gasped, taking her breath away, and then the man fell off his horse, landing most inelegantly in a nearby mud puddle. She rushed forward, quite without thinking, squealing something that was meant to inquire after his welfare, but that she suspected came out as nothing more than a strangled shriek. He would, of course, be furious with her, since she'd effectively knocked him off his horse and covered him with mud. 2 things guaranteed to put any gentleman in the foulest of moods. But when he finally rose to his feet, brushing off whatever mud could be dislodged from his clothing, he didn't lash out at her. He didn't give her a stinging set down. He didn't yell, he didn't even glare. He laughed. He laughed. Penelope hadn't much experience with the laughter of men, and what little she had known had not been kind. But this man's eyes, a rather intense shade of green, were filled with mirth as he wiped a rather embarrassingly placed spot of mud off his cheek and said, "Well, that wasn't very well done of me, was it?" And in that moment, Penelope fell in love when she found her voice, which, she was pained to note, was a good 3 seconds after a person of any intelligence would have replied. She said, "Oh, no, it is I who should apologize. My bonnet came right off my head, and..." She stopped talking when she realized he hadn't actually apologized, so there was little point in contradicting him. "It was no trouble," he said, giving her a somewhat amused smile. "Oh, good day, Daphne. Didn't know you were in the park." Penelope whirled around to find herself facing Daphne Bridgerton, standing next to her mother, who promptly hissed, "What have you done, Penelope Featherington?" And Penelope couldn't even answer with her stock, "Nothing," because in truth, the accident was completely her fault, and she'd just made a fool of herself in front of what was obviously, judging from the expression on her mother's face, a very eligible bachelor indeed. Not that her mother would have thought that she had a chance with him. But Mrs. Featherington held high matrimonial hopes for her older girls. Besides, Penelope wasn't even out in society yet. But if Mrs. Featherington intended to scold her any further, she was unable to do so, because that would have required that she remove her attention from the all-important Bridgertons, whose ranks, Penelope was quickly figuring out, included the man presently covered in mud. "I hope your son isn't injured," Mrs. Featherington said to Lady Bridgerton. Right as rain, Colin interjected, making an expert sidestep before Lady Bridgerton could maul him with motherly concern. Introductions were made, but the rest of the conversation was unimportant, mostly because Colin quickly and accurately sized up Mrs. Featherington as a matchmaking mama. Penelope was not at all surprised when he beat a hasty retreat. But the damage had already been done. Penelope had discovered a reason to dream. Later that night, as she replayed the encounter for about the 1,000th time in her mind, it occurred to her that it would have been nice if she could have said that she'd fallen in love with him as he kissed her hand before a dance, his green eyes twinkling devilishly while his fingers held hers just a little more tightly than was proper. Or maybe it could have happened as he rode boldly across a windswept moor, the aforementioned wind no deterrent as he, or rather, his horse, galloped ever closer, his, Colin's, not the horse's, only intention to reach her side. But no, she had to go and fall in love with Colin Bridgerton when he fell off a horse and landed on his bottom in a mud puddle. It was highly irregular, and highly unromantic, but there was a certain poetic justice in that, since nothing was ever going to come of it. Why waste romance on a love that would never be returned? Better to save the windswept moor introductions for people who might actually have a future together. And if there was one thing Penelope knew, even then, at the age of 16 years minus 2 days, it was that her future did not feature Colin Bridgerton in the role of husband. She simply wasn't the sort of girl who attracted a man like him, and she feared that she never would be. Asterisk on the 10th of April, in the year 1813, precisely 2 days after her 17th birthday, Penelope Featherington made her debut into London society. She hadn't wanted to do it. She begged her mother to let her wait a year. She was at least 2 stone heavier than she ought to be, and her face still had an awful tendency to develop spots whenever she was nervous, which meant that she always had spots, since nothing in the world could make her as nervous as a London ball. She tried to remind herself that beauty was only skin deep, but that didn't offer any helpful excuses when she was berating herself for never knowing what to say to people. There was nothing more depressing than an ugly girl with no personality. And in that first year on the marriage mart, that was exactly what Penelope was. An ugly girl with very well, she had to give herself some credit, with very little personality. Deep inside, she knew who she was, and that person was smart and kind and often even funny, but somehow her personality always got lost somewhere between her heart and her mouth, and she found herself saying the wrong thing or, more often, nothing at all. To make matters even less attractive, Penelope's mother refused to allow Penelope to choose her own clothing, and when she wasn't in the requisite white that most young ladies wore, and which of course didn't flatter her complexion one bit, she was forced to wear yellow and red and orange, all of which made her look perfectly wretched. The one time Penelope had suggested green, Mrs. Featherington had planted her hands on her more than ample hips and declared that green was too melancholy. Yellow, Mrs. Featherington declared, was a happy color and a happy girl would snare a husband. Penelope decided then and there that it was best not to try to understand the workings of her mother's mind. So Penelope found herself outfitted in yellow and orange and the occasional red, even though such colors made her look decidedly unhappy, and in fact were positively ghastly with her brown eyes and red-tinged hair. There was nothing she could do about it, though, so she decided to grin and bear it, and if she couldn't manage a grin, at least she wouldn't cry in public. Which, she took some pride in noting, she never did. And if that weren't enough, 1813 was the year that the mysterious, and fictitious, Lady Whistledown began publishing her thrice-weekly society papers. The single-sheet newspaper became an instant sensation. No one knew who Lady Whistledown really was, but everyone seemed to have a theory. For weeks, no, months, really, London could speak of nothing else. The paper had been delivered for free for 2 weeks, just long enough to addict the ton, and then suddenly there was no delivery, just paperboys charging the outrageous price of 5 pennies a paper. But by then, no one could live without the almost daily dose of gossip, and everyone paid their pennies. Somewhere some woman, or maybe, some people speculated, some man, was growing very rich indeed. What set Lady Whistledown's society papers apart from any previous society news sheets was that the author actually listed her subjects' names in full. There was no hiding behind abbreviations such as Lord P or Lady B. If Lady Whistledown wanted to write about someone, she used his full name. And when Lady Whistledown wanted to write about Penelope Featherington, she did. Penelope's first appearance in Lady Whistledown's society papers went as follows. Miss Penelope Featherington's unfortunate gown left the unfortunate girl looking like nothing more than an overripe citrus fruit. A rather stinging blow, to be sure, but nothing less than the truth. Her second appearance in the column was no better. Not a word was heard from Miss Penelope Featherington, and no wonder. The poor girl appeared to have drowned amidst the ruffles of her dress. Penelope was afraid anything that would enhance her popularity, but the season wasn't a complete disaster. There were a few people with whom she seemed able to speak. Lady Bridgerton, of all people, took a liking to her, and Penelope found that she could often tell things to the lovely Viscountess that she would never dream of saying to her own mother. It was through Lady Bridgerton that she met Eloise Bridgerton, the younger sister of her beloved Colin. Eloise was also just turned 17, but her mother had wisely allowed her to delay her debut by a year, even though Eloise possessed the Bridgerton good looks and charm in abundance, and while Penelope spent her afternoons in the green and cream drawing room at Bridgerton House, or, more often, up in Eloise's bedchamber where the two girls laughed and giggled and discussed everything under the sun with great earnestness, she found herself coming into occasional contact with Colin, who at 22 had not yet moved out of the family home and into bachelor lodgings. If Penelope had thought she loved him before, that was nothing compared to what she felt after actually getting to know him. Colin Bridgerton was witty, he was dashing, he had a devil-may-care jokester quality to him that made women swoon, but most of all, Colin Bridgerton was nice. Nice. Such a silly little word. It should have been banal, but somehow it fit him to perfection. He always had something nice to say to Penelope, and when she finally worked up the courage to say something back, other than the very basic greetings and farewells, he actually listened. Which made it all the easier the next time around. By the end of the season, Penelope judged that Colin Bridgerton was the only man with whom she'd managed an entire conversation. This was love. Oh, this was love, 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 love. A silly repetition of words, perhaps, but that was precisely what Penelope doodled on a ridiculously expensive sheet of writing paper, along with the words, Mrs. Colin Bridgerton and Penelope Bridgerton and Colin. The paper went into the fire the moment Penelope heard footsteps in the hall. How wonderful it was to feel love, even the one-sided sort, for a nice person. It made one feel so positively sensible. Of course, it didn't hurt that Colin possessed, as did all the Bridgerton men, fabulous good looks. There was that famous Bridgerton chestnut hair, the wide and smiling Bridgerton mouth, the broad shoulders, the 6-foot height, and in Colin's case, the most devastating green eyes ever to grace a human face. They were the sort of eyes that haunted a girl's dreams. And Penelope dreamed and dreamed and dreamed. April of 1814 found Penelope back in London for a second season, And even though she attracted the same number of suitors as the year before, 0, the season wasn't, in all honesty, quite so bad. It helped that she'd lost nearly 2 stone and could now call herself pleasantly rounded rather than a hideous pudge. She was still nowhere near the slender ideal of womanhood that ruled the day, but at least she'd changed enough to warrant the purchase of a completely new wardrobe. Unfortunately, her mother once again insisted on yellow, orange, and the occasional splash of red. And this time, Lady Whistledown wrote. Miss Penelope Featherington, the least inane of the Featherington sisters, wore a gown of lemon yellow that left a sour taste in one's mouth, which at least seemed to imply that Penelope was the most intelligent member of her family, although the compliment was backhanded, indeed. But Penelope wasn't the only one singled out by the acerbic gossip columnist. Dark-haired Kate Sheffield was likened to a singed daffodil in her yellow dress, and Kate went on to marry Anthony Bridgerton, Colin's older brother and a viscount to boot. So Penelope held out hope. Well, not really. She knew Colin wasn't going to marry her, but at least he danced with her at every ball, and he made her laugh, and every now and then she made him laugh, and she knew that that would have to be enough. And so Penelope's life continued. She had her 3rd season, then her 4th. Her 2 older sisters, Prudence and Philippa, finally found husbands of their own and moved away. Mrs. Featherington held out hope that Penelope might still make a match, since it had taken both Prudence and Philippa 5 seasons to snare husbands, but Penelope knew that she was destined to remain a spinster. It wouldn't be fair to marry someone when she was still so desperately in love with Colin. And maybe, in the far reaches of her mind, in the farthest back corner, tucked away behind the French verb conjugations she'd never mastered and the arithmetic she never used, she still held out a tiny shred of hope. Until that day. Even now, 7 years later, she still referred to it as that day. She'd gone to the Bridgerton household, as she frequently did, to take tea with Eloise and her mother and sisters. It was right before Eloise's brother Benedict had married Sophie, only he didn't know who she really was, and, well, that didn't signify, except that it may have been the one truly great secret in the last decade that Lady Whistledown had never managed to unearth. Anyway, she was walking through the front hall, listening to her feet tap along the marble tile as she saw herself out. She was adjusting her pelisse and preparing to walk the short distance to her own home, just around the corner, really, when she heard voices. Male voices. Male Bridgerton voices. It was the 3 elder Bridgerton brothers, Anthony, Benedict, and Colin. They were having one of those conversations that men have, the kind in which they grumble a lot and poke fun at each other. Penelope had always liked to watch the Bridgertons interact in this manner, they were such a family. Penelope could see them through the open front door, but she couldn't hear what they were saying until she'd reached the threshold. And in a testament to the bad timing that had plagued her throughout her life, the first voice she heard was Colin's, and the words were not kind. And I am certainly not going to marry Penelope Featherington. Oh. The word slipped over her lips before she could even think, the squeal of it piercing the air like an off-key whistle. The 3 Bridgerton men turned to face her with identical horrified faces, and Penelope knew that she had just entered into what would certainly be the most awful 5 minutes of her life. She said nothing for what seemed like an eternity, and then, finally, with a dignity she never dreamed she possessed, she looked straight at Colin and said, "I never asked you to marry me." His cheeks went from pink to red. He opened his mouth, but not a sound came out. It was, Penelope thought with wry satisfaction, probably the only time in his life he'd ever been at a loss for words. "And I never," she swallowed convulsively. "I never said to anyone that I wanted you to ask me." "Penelope," Colin finally managed, "I'm so sorry." "You have nothing to apologize for," she said. "No," he insisted, "I do. I hurt your feelings, Anne. You didn't know I was there. But nevertheless. You are not going to marry me," she said, her voice sounding very strange and hollow to her ears. "There is nothing wrong with that. I am not going to marry your brother Benedict." Benedict had clearly been trying not to look, but he snapped to attention at that. Penelope fisted her hands at her sides. It doesn't hurt his feelings when I announce that I am not going to marry him. She turned to Benedict, forcing her eyes directly on his. Does it, Mr. Bridgerton? Of course not, Benedict answered quickly. It's settled, then, she said tightly, amazed that, for once, exactly the right words were coming out of her mouth. No feelings were hurt. Now, then, if you will excuse me, gentlemen, I should like to go home. The three gentlemen immediately stood back to let her pass, and she would have made a clean escape, except that Colin suddenly blurted out, "Don't you have a maid?" She shook her head. "I live just around the corner." "I know, but—" "I'll escort you," Anthony said smoothly. "That's really not necessary, my lord." "Humor me," he said, in a tone that told her quite clearly she hadn't any choice in the matter. She nodded, and the two of them took off down the street. After they had passed about 3 houses, Anthony said in a strangely respectful voice, "He didn't know you were there." Penelope felt her lips tighten at the corners, not out of anger, just out of a weary sense of resignation. "I know," she replied. "He's not the sort to be cruel." "I expect your mother has been hounding him to get married." Anthony nodded. Lady Bridgerton's intentions to see each and every one of her 8 offspring happily married were legendary. "She likes me," Penelope said. "Your mother, that is." "She can't see beyond that, I'm afraid. But the truth is, it doesn't matter so much if she likes Colin's bride." "Well, I wouldn't say that," Anthony mused, sounding not so much like a highly feared and respected viscount and rather more like a well-behaved son. "I shouldn't like to be married to someone my mother didn't like." He shook his head in a gesture of great awe and respect. "She's a force of nature." "Your mother or your wife?" He considered that for about half a second. "Both." They walked for a few moments, and then Penelope blurted out, "Colin should go away." Anthony eyed her curiously. "I beg your pardon?" "He should go away. Travel. He's not ready to marry, and your mother won't be able to restrain herself from pressuring him." "She means well." Penelope bit her lip in horror. She hoped the Viscount didn't think she was actually criticizing Lady Bridgerton. As far as she was concerned, there was no greater lady in England. "My mother always means well," Anthony said with an indulgent smile. "But maybe you're right. Perhaps he should get away. Colin does enjoy travel, although he did just return from Wales." "Did he?" Penelope murmured politely, as if she didn't know perfectly well that he'd been in Wales. "Here we are," he said as he nodded his reply. "This is your house, is it not?" "Yes. Thank you for accompanying me home." "It was my pleasure, I assure you." Penelope watched as he left, then she went inside and cried. The very next day, the following account appeared in Lady Whistledown's society papers. "La, but such excitement yesterday on the front steps of Lady Bridgerton's residence on Bruton Street. First, Penelope Featherington was seen in the company of not 1, not 2, but 3 Bridgerton brothers, surely a heretofore impossible feat for the poor girl, who was rather infamous for her wallflower ways. Sadly, but perhaps predictably, for Miss Featherington, when she finally departed, it was on the arm of the Viscount, the only married man in the bunch. If Miss Featherington were to somehow manage to drag a Bridgerton brother to the altar, it would surely mean the end of the world as we know it, and this author, who freely admits she would not know heads from tails in such a world, would be forced to resign her post on the spot. It seemed even Lady Whistledown understood the futility of Penelope's feelings for Colin. The years drifted by, and somehow, without realizing it, Penelope ceased to be a debutante and found herself sitting with the chaperones, watching her younger sister Felicity, surely the only Featherington sister blessed with both natural beauty and charm, enjoying her own London seasons. Colin developed a taste for travel and began to spend more and more time outside of London. It seemed that every few months he was off to some new destination. When he was in town, he always saved a dance and a smile for Penelope, and somehow she managed to pretend that nothing had ever happened, that he'd never declared his distaste for her on a public street, that her dreams had never been shattered. And when he was in town, which wasn't often, they seemed to settle into an easy, if not terribly deep, friendship. Which was all an almost 28-year-old spinster could hope for, right? Unrequited love was never easy, but at least Penelope Featherington was used to it. Chapter 1. Matchmaking mamas are united in their glee. Colin Bridgerton has returned from Greece. For those gentle and ignorant readers who are new to town this year, Mr. Bridgerton is third in the legendary string of 8 Bridgerton siblings, hence the name Colin, beginning with C. He follows Anthony and Benedict, and precedes Daphne, Eloise, Francesca, Gregory, and Hyacinth. Although Mr. Bridgerton holds no noble title and is unlikely ever to do so, he is 7th in line for the title of Viscount Bridgerton, behind the 2 sons of the current Viscount, his elder brother Benedict, and his 3 sons. He is still considered one of the prime catches of the season, due to his fortune, his face, his form, and most of all, his charm. It is difficult, however, to predict whether Mr. Bridgerton will succumb to matrimonial bliss this season. He is certainly of an age to marry, 33, but he has never shown a decided interest in any lady of proper parentage, and to make matters even more complicated, he has an appalling tendency to leave London at the drop of a hat, bound for some exotic destination. Lady Whistledown's Society Papers, April 2, 1824. Look at this. Portia Featherington squealed. Colin Bridgerton is back. Penelope looked up from her needlework. Her mother was clutching the latest edition of Lady Whistledown's Society Papers the way Penelope might clutch, say, a rope while hanging off a building. I know, she murmured. Portia frowned. She hated when anyone, was aware of gossip before she was. How did you get to Whistledown before I did? I told Brierly to set it aside for me and not to let anyone touch. I didn't see it in Whistledown, Penelope interrupted, before her mother went off to castigate the poor, beleaguered butler. Felicity told me. Yesterday afternoon. Hyacinth Bridgerton told her. Your sister spends a great deal of time over at the Bridgerton household. As do I, Penelope pointed out, wondering where this was leading. Portia tapped her finger against the side of her chin, as she always did when she was plotting or scheming. Colin Bridgerton is of an age to be looking for a wife. Penelope managed to blink just before her eyes bugged right out of her head. Colin Bridgerton is not going to marry Felicity. Portia gave a little shrug. Stranger things have happened. Not that I've ever seen, Penelope muttered. Anthony Bridgerton married that Kate Sheffield girl, and she was even less popular than you. That wasn't exactly true. Penelope rather thought they'd been on equally low rungs of the social ladder. But there seemed little point in telling this to her mother, who probably thought she'd complimented her third daughter by saying she'd not been the least popular girl that season. Penelope felt her lips tightening. Her mother's compliments had a habit of landing rather like wasps. Do not think I mean to criticize, Portia said, suddenly all concern. In truth, I am glad for your spinsterhood. I am alone in this world save for my daughters, and it's comforting to know that one of you shall be able to care for me in my older years. Penelope had a vision of the future as described by her mother, and she had a sudden urge to run out and marry the chimney sweep. She'd long since resigned herself to a life of eternal spinsterhood, but somehow she'd always pictured herself off in her own neat little terrace house. Or maybe a snug cottage by the sea. But lately Portia had been peppering her conversations with references to her old age and how lucky she was that Penelope could care for her. Never mind that both Prudence and Philippa had married well-heeled men and possessed ample funds to see to their mother's every comfort. Or that Portia was moderately wealthy in her own right. When her family had settled money on her as a dowry, 1/4 had been set aside for her own personal account. No, when Portia talked about being cared for, she wasn't referring to money. What Portia wanted was a slave. Penelope sighed. She was being overly harsh with her mother, if only in her own mind. She did that too often. Her mother loved her. She knew her mother loved her, and she loved her mother back. It was just that sometimes she didn't much like her mother. She hoped that didn't make her a bad person. But truly, her mother could try the patience of even the kindest, gentlest of daughters, and as Penelope was the first to admit, she could be a wee bit sarcastic at times. "Why don't you think Colin would marry Felicity?" Portia asked. Penelope looked up, startled. She'd thought they were done with that subject. She should have known better. Her mother was nothing if not tenacious. "Well," she said slowly, "to begin with, she's 12 years younger than he is." "Pfft," Portia said, waving her hand dismissively. "That's nothing, and you know it." Penelope frowned, then yelped as she accidentally stabbed her finger with her needle. "Besides," Portia continued blithely, she looked back down at Whistledown and scanned it for his exact age, 33. How is he meant to avoid a 12-year difference between him and his wife? Surely you don't expect him to marry someone your age." Penelope sucked on her abused finger even though she knew it was hopelessly uncouth to do so, but she needed to put something in her mouth to keep her from saying something horrible and horribly spiteful. Everything her mother said was true. Many-ton weddings, maybe even most of them, saw men marrying girls a dozen or more years their junior. But somehow the age gap between Colin and Felicity seemed even larger, perhaps because Penelope was unable to keep the disgust off her face. "She's like a sister to him. A little sister." "Really, Penelope?" "I hardly think." "It's almost incestuous," Penelope muttered. "What did you say?" Penelope snatched up her needlework again. "Nothing." "I'm sure you said something." Penelope shook her head. "I did clear my throat." "Perhaps you heard." "I heard you saying something." "I'm sure of it." Penelope groaned. Her life loomed long and tedious ahead of her. "Mother," she said, with the patience of, if not a saint, at least a very devout nun, "Felicity is practically engaged to Mr. Albansdale." Portia actually began rubbing her hands together. "She won't be engaged to him if she can catch Colin Bridgerton. Felicity would die before chasing after Colin." "Of course not. She's a smart girl. Anyone can see that Colin Bridgerton is a better catch. But Felicity loves Mr. Albansdale." Portia deflated into her perfectly upholstered chair. "There is that. And," Penelope added with great feeling, "Mr. Albansdale is in possession of a perfectly respectable fortune." Portia tapped her index finger against her cheek. "True. Not," she said sharply, "as respectable as a Bridgerton portion, but it's nothing to sneeze at, I suppose." Penelope knew it was time to let it go, but she couldn't stop her mouth from opening one last time. "In all truth, Mother, he's a wonderful match for Felicity. We should be delighted for her." I know," Portia grumbled. "It's just that I so wanted one of my daughters to marry a Bridgerton. What a coup! I would be the talk of London for weeks. Years, maybe." Penelope stabbed her needle into the cushion beside her. It was a rather foolish way to vent her anger, but the alternative was to jump to her feet and yell, "What about me?" Portia seemed to think that once Felicity was wed, her hopes for a Bridgerton union were forever dashed. But Penelope was still unmarried, didn't that count for anything? Was it so much to wish that her mother thought of her with the same pride she felt for her other 3 daughters? Penelope knew that Colin wasn't going to choose her as his bride, but shouldn't a mother be at least a little bit blind to her children's faults? It was obvious to Penelope that neither Prudence, Philippa, nor even Felicity had ever had a chance with a Bridgerton. Why did her mother seem to think their charms so exceeded Penelope's? Very well, Penelope had to admit that Felicity enjoyed a popularity that exceeded that of her 3 older sisters combined. But Prudence and Philippa had never been incomparables. They'd hovered on the perimeters of ballrooms just as much as Penelope had. Except, of course, that they were married now. Penelope wouldn't have wanted to cleave herself unto either of their husbands, but at least they were wives. Thankfully, however, Portia's mind had already moved on to greener pastures. "I must pay a call upon Violet," she was saying. "She'll be so relieved that Colin is back." "I'm sure Lady Bridgerton will be delighted to see you," Penelope said. That poor woman, Portia said, her sigh dramatic. She worries about him, you know. I know. Truly, I think it is more than a mother should be expected to bear. He goes gallivanting about, the good Lord only knows where, to countries that are positively unheathen. I believe they practice Christianity in Greece, Penelope murmured, her eyes back down on her needlework. Don't be impertinent, Penelope and Featherington, and they're Catholics. Portia shuddered on the word. They're not Catholics at all, Penelope replied, giving up on the needlework and setting it aside. They're Greek Orthodox. Well, they're not Church of England, Portia said with a sniff. Seeing as how they're Greek, I don't think they're terribly worried about that. Portia's eyes narrowed disapprovingly. And how do you know about this Greek religion, anyway? No, don't tell me, she said with a dramatic flourish. You read it somewhere. Penelope just blinked as she tried to think of a suitable reply. I wish you wouldn't read so much, Portia sighed. I probably could have married you off years ago if you had concentrated more on the social graces and less on. Penelope had to ask. Less on what? I don't know. Whatever it is you do that has you staring into space and daydreaming so often. I'm just thinking, Penelope said quietly. Sometimes I just like to stop and think. Stop what? Portia wanted to know. Penelope couldn't help but smile. Portia's query seemed to sum up all that was different between mother and daughter. It's nothing, mother, Penelope said. Really? Portia looked as if she wanted to say more, then thought the better of it. Or maybe she was just hungry. She did pluck his cute off the tea tray and pop it into her mouth. Penelope started to reach out to take the last is cute for herself, then decided to let her mother have it. She might as well keep her mother's mouth full. The last thing she wanted was to find herself in another conversation about Colin Bridgerton. Colin's back. Penelope looked up from her book, A Brief History of Greece, to see Eloise Bridgerton bursting into her room. As usual, Eloise had not been announced. The Featherington butler was so used to seeing her there that he treated her like a member of the family. Is he? Penelope asked, managing to feign, in her opinion, rather realistic indifference. Of course, she did set A Brief History of Greece down behind Matilda, the novel by S.R. Fielding that had been all the rage a year earlier. Everyone had a copy of Matilda on their bedstand. And it was thick enough to hide A Brief History of Greece. Eloise sat down in Penelope's desk chair. Indeed, and he's very tanned. All that time in the sun, I suppose. He went to Greece, didn't he? Eloise shook her head. He said the war there has worsened, and it was too dangerous, so he went to Cyprus instead. My, Penelope said with a smile. Lady Whistledown got something wrong. Eloise smiled that cheeky Bridgerton smile, and once again Penelope realized how lucky she was to have her as her closest friend. She and Eloise had been inseparable since the age of 17. They'd had their London seasons together, reached adulthood together, and, much to their mother's dismay, had become spinsters together. Eloise claimed that she hadn't met the right person. Penelope, of course, hadn't been asked. Did he enjoy Cyprus? Penelope inquired. Eloise sighed. He said it was brilliant. How I should love to travel. It seems everyone has been somewhere but me. And me, Penelope reminded her. And you, Eloise agreed. Thank goodness for you. Eloise. Penelope exclaimed, throwing a pillow at her. But she thanked goodness for Eloise, too. Every day. Many women went through their entire lives without a close female friend, and here she had someone to whom she could tell anything. Well, almost anything. Penelope had never told her of her feelings for Colin, although she rather thought Eloise suspected the truth. Eloise was far too tactful to mention it, though, which only validated Penelope's certainty that Colin would never love her. If Eloise had thought, for even one moment, that Penelope actually had a chance at snaring Colin as a husband, she would have been plotting her matchmaking strategies with a ruthlessness that would have impressed any army general. When it came right down to it, Eloise was a rather managing sort of person. And then he said that the water was so choppy that he actually cast up his accounts over the side of the boat, and Eloise scowled. "You're not listening to me." "No," Penelope admitted. "Well, yes, actually, parts of it." "I cannot believe Colin actually told you he vomited." "Well, I am his sister. He'd be furious with you if he knew you'd told me." Eloise waved off her protest. "He won't mind. You're like another sister to him." Penelope smiled, but she sighed at the same time. Mother asked him, of course, whether he was planning to remain in town for the season, Eloise continued, and, of course, he was terribly evasive, but then I decided to interrogate him myself. "Terribly smart of you," Penelope murmured. Eloise threw the pillow back at her. "And I finally got him to admit to me that yes, he thinks he will stay for at least a few months. But he made me promise not to tell Mother." Now, that's not, Penelope cleared her throat, terribly intelligent of him. If your mother thinks his time here is limited, she will redouble her efforts to see him married. I should think that was what he wanted most to avoid. It does seem his usual aim in life, Eloise concurred. If he lulled her into thinking that there was no rush, perhaps she might not badger him quite so much. An interesting idea, Eloise said, but probably more true in theory than in practice. My mother is so determined to see him wed that it matters not if she increases her efforts. Her regular efforts are enough to drive him mad as it is. Can one go doubly mad? Penelope mused. Eloise cocked her head. I don't know, she said. I don't think I should want to find out. They both fell silent for a moment, a rare occurrence, indeed, and then Eloise quite suddenly jumped to her feet and said, I must go. Penelope smiled. People who didn't know Eloise very well thought she had a habit of changing the subject frequently and abruptly, but Penelope knew that the truth was something else altogether. When Eloise had her mind set on something, she was completely unable to let it go. Which I meant that if Eloise suddenly wanted to leave, it probably had to do with something they'd been talking about earlier in the afternoon, and Colin is expected for tea, Eloise explained. Penelope smiled. She loved being right. You should come, Eloise said. Penelope shook her head. He'll want it to be just family. You're probably right, Eloise said, nodding slightly. Very well, then, I must be off. Terribly sorry to cut my visit so short, but I wanted to be sure that you knew Colin was home. Whistle down, Penelope reminded her. Right. Where does that woman get her information? Eloise said, shaking her head in wonder. I vow sometimes she knows so much about my family, I wonder if I ought to be frightened. She can't go on forever, Penelope commented, getting up to see her friend out. Someone will eventually figure out who she is, don't you think? I don't know. Eloise put her hand on the doorknob, twisted, and pulled. I used to think so. But it's been 10 years. More, actually. If she were going to be caught, I think it would have happened already. Penelope followed Eloise down the stairs. Eventually, she'll make a mistake. She has to, she's only human. Eloise laughed. And here I thought she was a minor god. Penelope found herself grinning. Eloise stopped and whirled around so suddenly that Penelope crashed right into her, nearly sending both of them tumbling down the last few steps on the staircase. Do you know what? Eloise demanded. I couldn't begin to speculate. Eloise didn't even bother to pull a face. I'd wager that she has made a mistake, she said. I beg your pardon? You said it yourself. She, or it could be he, I suppose, has been writing the column for over a decade. No one could do that for so long without making a mistake. Do you know what I think? Penelope just spread her hands in an impatient gesture. I think the problem is that the rest of us are too stupid to notice her mistakes. Penelope stared at her for a moment, then burst out laughing. Oh, Eloise, she said, wiping tears from her eyes. I do love you. Eloise grinned. And it's a good thing you do, spinster that I am. We shall have to set up a household together when we are 30 and truly crones. Penelope caught hold of the idea like a lifeboat. Do you think we could? She exclaimed. And then, in a hushed voice, after looking furtively up and down the hall, Mother has begun to speak of her old age with alarming frequency. What's so alarming about that? I'm in all of her visions, waiting on her hand and foot. Oh, dear. A milder expletive than had crossed my mind. Penelope. But Eloise was grinning. I love my mother, Penelope said. I know you do, Eloise said, in a rather placating sort of voice. No, I really do. The left corner of Eloise's mouth began to twitch. I know you. Really do, really. It's just that. Eloise put up a hand. You don't need to say any more. I understand perfectly. Oh. Good day, Mrs. Featherington. Eloise, Portia said, bustling down the hall. I didn't realize you were here. I'm sneaky as always, Eloise said. Cheeky, even. Portia gave her an indulgent smile. I heard your brother is back in town. Yes, we are all overjoyed. I'm sure you must be, especially your mother. Indeed. She is beside herself. I believe she is drawing up a list right now. Portia's entire aspect perked up, as it did at the mention of anything that might be construed as gossip. A list? What sort of list? Oh, you know, the same list she has made for all of her adult children. Prospective spouses and all that. It makes me wonder, Penelope said in a dry voice, what constitutes all that. Sometimes she includes one or two people who are hopelessly unsuitable so as to highlight the qualities of the real possibilities. Portia laughed. Perhaps she'll put you on Colin's list, Penelope. Penelope didn't laugh. Neither did Eloise. Portia didn't seem to notice. Well, I'd best be off, Eloise said, clearing her throat to cover a moment that was awkward to two of the three people in the hall. Colin is expected for tea. Mother wants the entire family in attendance. Will you all fit? Penelope asked. Lady Bridgerton's home was large, but the Bridgerton children, spouses, and grandchildren numbered 21. It was a large brood, indeed. We're going to Bridgerton House, Eloise explained. Her mother had moved out of the Bridgertons' official London residence after her eldest son had married. Anthony, who had been Viscount since the age of 18, had told Violet that she needn't go, but she had insisted that he and his wife needed their privacy. As a result, Anthony and Kate lived with their 3 children in Bridgerton House, while Violet lived with her unmarried children, with the exception of Colin, who kept his own lodgings, just a few blocks away at 5 Bruton Street. After a year or so of unsuccessful attempts to name Lady Bridgerton's new home, the family had taken to calling it simply Number 5. Do enjoy yourself, Portia said. I must go and find Felicity. We are late for an appointment at the modiste. Eloise watched Portia disappear up the stairs, then said to Penelope, Your sister seems to spend a great deal of time at the modiste. Penelope shrugged. Felicity is going mad with all the fittings, but she's Mother's only hope for a truly grand match. I'm afraid she's convinced that Felicity will catch a duke if she's wearing the right gown. Isn't she practically engaged to Mr. Albansdale? I imagine he'll make a formal offer next week. But until then, Mother is keeping her options open. She rolled her eyes. You'd best warn your brother to keep his distance. Gregory? Eloise asked in disbelief. He's not even out of university. Colin. Colin? Eloise exploded with laughter. Oh, that's rich. That's what I told her, but you know how she is once she gets an idea in her head. Eloise chuckled. Rather like me, I imagine. Tenacious to the end. Tenacity can be a very good thing, Eloise reminded her, at the proper time. Right, Penelope returned with a sarcastic smile, and at the improper time, it's an absolute nightmare. Eloise laughed. Cheer up, friend. At least she let you rid yourself of all those yellow frocks. Penelope looked down at her morning dress, which was, if she did say so herself, a rather flattering shade of blue. She stopped choosing my clothing once she finally realized I was officially on the shelf. A girl with no marriage prospects isn't worth the time and energy it takes her to offer fashion advice. She hasn't accompanied me to the modiste in over a year. Bliss. Eloise smiled at her friend, whose complexion turned the loveliest peaches and cream whenever she wore cooler hues. It was apparent to all, the moment you were allowed to choose your own clothing. Even Lady Whistledown commented upon it. I hid that column from Mother, Penelope admitted. I didn't want her feelings to be hurt. Eloise blinked a few times before saying, "That was very kind of you, Penelope. I have my moments of charity and grace." One would think, Eloise said with a snort, that a vital component of charity and grace is the ability not to draw attention to one's possession of them. Penelope pursed her lips as she pushed Eloise toward the door. Don't you need to go home? I'm leaving. I'm leaving. And she left. It was. Colin Bridgerton decided as he took a sip of some truly excellent brandy, rather nice to be back in England. It was quite strange, actually, how he loved returning home just as much as he did the departure. In another few months, 6 at the most, he'd be itching to leave again, but for now, England in April was positively brilliant. It's good, isn't it? Colin looked up. His brother Anthony was leaning against the front of his massive mahogany desk, motioning to him with his own glass of brandy. Colin nodded. Hadn't realized how much I missed it until I returned. Ouzo has its charms, but this, he lifted his glass, is heaven. Anthony smiled wryly. And how long do you plan to remain this time? Colin wandered over to the window and pretended to look out. His eldest brother made little attempt to disguise his impatience with Colin's wanderlust. In truth, Colin really couldn't blame him. Occasionally, it was difficult to get letters home. He supposed that his family often had to wait a month or even 2 for word of his welfare, but while he knew that he would not relish being in their shoes, never knowing if a loved one was dead or alive, constantly waiting for the knock of the messenger at the front door, that just wasn't enough to keep his feet firmly planted in England. Every now and then, he simply had to get away. There was no other way to describe it. Away from the ton, who thought him a charming rogue and nothing else, away from England, which encouraged younger sons to enter the military or the clergy, neither of which suited his temperament. Even away from his family, who loved him unconditionally but had no clue that what he really wanted, deep down inside, was something to do. His brother Anthony held the viscountcy, and with that came myriad responsibilities. He ran estates, managed the family's finances, and saw to the welfare of countless tenants and servants. Benedict, his elder by 4 years, had gained renown as an artist. He'd started with pencil and paper, but at the urging of his wife had moved on to oils. One of his landscapes now hung in the National Gallery. Anthony would be forever remembered in family trees as the 7th Viscount Bridgerton. Benedict would live through his paintings, long after he left this earth. But Colin had nothing. He managed the small property given to him by his family and he attended parties. He would never dream of claiming he didn't have fun, but sometimes he wanted something a little more than fun. He wanted a purpose. He wanted a legacy. He wanted, if not to know then at least to hope, that when he was gone, he'd be memorialized in some manner other than in Lady Whistledown's society papers. He sighed. No wonder he spent so much time traveling. Colin, his brother prompted. Colin turned to him and blinked. He was fairly certain Anthony had asked him a question, but somewhere in the meanderings of his mind, he'd forgotten what. Oh. Right. Colin cleared his throat. I'll be here for the rest of the season, at least. Anthony said nothing, but it was difficult to miss the satisfied expression on his face. If nothing else, Colin added, affixing his legendary crooked grin on his face, someone has to spoil your children. I don't think Charlotte has nearly enough dolls. Only 50, Anthony agreed in a deadpan voice. The poor girl is horribly neglected. Her birthday is at the end of this month, is it not? I shall have to neglect her some more, I think. Speaking of birthdays, Anthony said, settling into the large chair behind his desk, Mother's is a week from Sunday. Why do you think I hurried to return? Anthony raised a brow, and Colin had the distinct impression that he was trying to decide if Colin had truly rushed home for their mother's birthday, or if he was simply taking advantage of some very good timing. We're holding a party for her, Anthony said. She's letting you? It was Colin's experience that women of a certain age did not enjoy birthday celebrations. And although his mother was still exceedingly lovely, she was definitely of a certain age. We were forced to resort to blackmail, Anthony admitted. She agreed to the party, or we revealed her true age. Colin shouldn't have taken a sip of his brandy, he choked on it and just barely managed to avert spraying it all over his brother. I should have liked to have seen that. Anthony offered a rather satisfied smile. It was a brilliant maneuver on my part. Colin finished the rest of his drink. What, do you think, are the chances she won't use the party as an opportunity to find me a wife? Very small. I thought so. Anthony leaned back in his chair. You are 33 now, Colin. Colin stared at him in disbelief. God above, don't you start on me. I wouldn't dream of it. I was merely going to suggest that you keep your eyes open this season. You needn't actively look for a wife, but there's no harm in remaining at least amenable to the possibility. Colin eyed the doorway, intending to pass through it very shortly. I assure you, I am not averse to the idea of marriage. I didn't think you were, Anthony demurred. I see little reason to rush, however. There's never a reason to rush, Anthony returned. Well, rarely, anyway. Just humor Mother, will you? Colin hadn't realized he was still holding his empty glass until it slipped through his fingers and landed on the carpet with a loud thunk. Good God, he whispered, is she ill? No. Anthony said, his surprise making his voice loud and forceful. She'll outlive us all, I'm sure of it. Then what is this about? Anthony sighed. I just want to see you happy. I am happy, Colin insisted. Are you? Hell, I'm the happiest man in London. Just read Lady Whistledown. She'll tell you so. Anthony glanced down at the paper on his desk. Well, maybe not this column, but anything from last year. I've been called charming more times than Lady Danbury has been called opinionated, and we both know what a feat that is. Charming doesn't necessarily equal happy, Anthony said softly. I don't have time for this, Colin muttered. The door had never looked so good. If you were truly happy, Anthony persisted, you wouldn't keep leaving. Colin paused with his hand on the doorknob. Anthony, I like to travel. Constantly? I must, or I wouldn't do it. That's an evasive sentence if ever I've heard one. And this, Colin flashed his brother a wicked smile, is an evasive maneuver. Colin. But he'd already left the room. Chapter 2. It has always been fashionable among the ton to complain of ennui, but surely this year's crop of partygoers has raised boredom to an art form. One cannot take two steps at a society function these days without hearing the phrase dreadfully dull, or hopelessly banal. Indeed, this author has even been informed that Cressida Twombly recently remarked that she was convinced that she might perish of eternal boredom if forced to attend one more off-key musicale. This author must concur with Lady Twombly on that note. While this year's selection of debutantes are an amiable bunch, there is not a decent musician among them. If there is to be an antidote for the disease of tedium, surely it will be Sunday's fete at Bridgerton House. The entire family will gather, along with 100 or so of their closest friends, to celebrate the Dowager Viscountess's birthday. It is considered crass to mention a lady's age, and so this author will not reveal which birthday Lady Bridgerton is celebrating. But have no fear. This author knows. Lady Whistledown's Society Papers, April 9, 1824. Spinsterhood was a word that tended to invoke either panic or pity, but Penelope was coming to realize that there were decided advantages to the unmarried state. First of all, no one really expected the spinsters to dance at balls, which meant that Penelope was no longer forced to hover at the edge of the dance floor, looking this way and that, pretending that she didn't really want to dance. Now she could sit off to the side with the other spinsters and chaperones. She still wanted to dance, of course, she rather liked dancing, and she was actually quite good at it, not that anyone ever noticed. But it was much easier to feign disinterest the farther one got from the waltzing couples. Second, the number of hours spent in dull conversation had been drastically reduced. Mrs. Featherington had officially given up hope that Penelope might ever snag a husband, and so she'd stopped thrusting her in the path of every third-tier eligible bachelor. Portia had never really thought Penelope had a prayer of attracting the attention of a first- or second-tier bachelor, which was probably true, but most of the third-tier bachelors were classified as such for a reason, and sadly, that reason was often personality, or lack thereof. Which, when combined with Penelope's shyness with strangers, didn't tend to promote sparkling conversation. And finally, she could eat again. It was maddening, considering the amount of food generally on display at ton parties, but women on the hunt for husbands weren't supposed to exhibit anything more robust than a bird's appetite. This, Penelope thought gleefully, as she bit into what had to be the most heavenly éclair outside of France, had to be the best spinster perk of all. Good heavens, she moaned. If sin could take a solid form, surely it would be a pastry. Preferably one with chocolate. That good, eh? Penelope choked on the éclair, then coughed, sending a fine spray of pastry cream through the air. Colin, she gasped, fervently praying the largest of the globs had missed his ear. Penelope. He smiled warmly. It's good to see you. And you. He rocked on his heels, once, twice, thrice, then said, You. Look well. And you, she said, too preoccupied with trying to figure out where to set down her éclair to offer much variety to her conversation. That's a nice dress, he said, motioning to her green silk gown. She smiled ruefully, explaining, It's not yellow. So it's not. He grinned, and the ice was broken. It was strange, because one would think her tongue would be tied the tightest around the man she loved, but there was something about Colin that set everyone at ease. Maybe, Penelope had thought on more than one occasion, part of the reason she loved him was that he made her feel comfortable with herself. Eloise tells me you had a splendid time in Cyprus, she said. He grinned. Couldn't resist the birthplace of Aphrodite, after all. Penelope found herself smiling as well. His good humor was infectious, even if the last thing she wanted to do was take part in a discussion of the goddess of love. Was it as sunny as everyone says, she asked. No, forget I asked. I can see from your face that it was. I did acquire a bit of a tan, he said with a nod. My mother nearly fainted when she saw me. From delight, I'm sure, Penelope said emphatically. She misses you terribly when you're gone. He leaned in. Come, now, Penelope, surely you're not going to start in on me. Between my mother, Anthony, Eloise, and Daphne, I'm liable to perish of guilt. Not Benedict, she couldn't help quipping. He shot her a slightly smirky look. He's out of town. Ah, well, that explains his silence. His narrowed eyes matched his crossed arms to perfection. You've always been cheeky, did you know that? I hide it well, she said modestly. It's easy to see, he said in a dry voice, why you are such good friends with my sister. I'm assuming you intended that as a compliment? I'm fairly certain I'd be endangering my health if I'd intended it any other way. Penelope was standing there, hoping she'd think of a witty rejoinder when she heard a strange, wet, splattish sound. She looked down to discover that a large yellowish blob of pastry cream had slid from her half-eaten éclair and landed on the pristine wooden floor. She looked back up to find Colin's oh-so-green eyes dancing with laughter, even as his mouth fought for a serious expression. Well, now, that's embarrassing, Penelope said, deciding that the only way to avoid dying of mortification was to state the painfully obvious. I suggest, Colin said, raising one brow into a perfectly debonair arch, that we flee the scene. Penelope looked down at the empty carcass still in her hand. Colin answered her with a nod toward a nearby potted plant. No, she said, her eyes growing wide. He leaned in closer. I dare you. Her eyes darted from Claire to the plant and back to Colin's face. I couldn't, she said. As far as naughty things go, this one is fairly mild, he pointed out. It was a dare, and Penelope was usually immune to such childish ploys, but Colin's half-smile was difficult to resist. Very well, she said, squaring her shoulders and dropping the pastry onto the soil. She took a step back, examined her handiwork, looked around to see if anyone besides Colin was watching her, then leaned down and rotated the pot so that a leafy branch covered the evidence. I didn't think you'd do it, Colin said. As you said, it's not terribly naughty. No, but it is my mother's favorite potted palm. Colin. Penelope whirled around, fully intending to sink her hand right back into the plant to retrieve the eclair. How could you let me? Wait a second. She straightened, her eyes narrowed. This isn't a palm. He was all innocence. It's not? It's a miniature orange tree. He blinked. Is it, now? She scowled at him. Or at least she hoped it was a scowl. It was difficult to scowl at Colin Bridgerton. Even his mother had once remarked that it was nearly impossible to reprimand him. He would just smile and look contrite and say something funny, and you just couldn't stay angry with him. You simply couldn't do it. You were trying to make me feel guilty, Penelope said. Anyone could confuse a palm with an orange tree. She fought the urge to roll her eyes. Except for the oranges. He chewed on his lower lip, his eyes thoughtful. Yes, one would think they'd be a bit of a giveaway. You're a terrible liar, did you know that? He straightened, tugging slightly at his waistcoat as he lifted his chin. Actually, I'm an excellent liar. But what I'm really good at is appearing appropriately sheepish and adorable after I'm caught. What, Penelope wondered, was she meant to say to that? Because surely there was no one more adorably sheepishly adorable, than Colin Bridgerton with his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes flitting along the ceiling, and his lips puckered into an innocent whistle. When you were a child, Penelope asked, abruptly changing the subject, were you ever punished? Colin immediately straightened to attention. I beg your pardon? Were you ever punished as a child? She repeated. Are you ever punished now? Colin just stared at her, wondering if she had any idea what she was asking. Probably not. He said, mostly because he hadn't anything else to say. She let out a vaguely patronizing sigh. I thought not. If he were a less indulgent man, and if this were anyone but Penelope Featherington, whom he knew did not possess a malicious bone in her body, he might take offense. But he was an uncommonly easygoing fellow, and this was Penelope Featherington, who had been a faithful friend to his sister for God knows how many years, so instead of adopting a hard, cynical stare, which, admittedly, was an expression at which he'd never excelled, he merely smiled and murmured, your point being? Do not think I mean to criticize your parents, she said with an expression that was innocent and sly at the same time. I would never dream of implying that you were spoiled in any way. He nodded graciously. It's just that, she leaned in, as if imparting a grave secret, I rather think you could get away with murder if you so chose. He coughed, not to clear his throat and not because he wasn't feeling well, but rather because he was so damned startled. Penelope was such a funny character. No, that wasn't quite right. She was surprising. Yes, that seemed to sum her up. Very few people really knew her. She had certainly never developed a reputation as a sterling conversationalist. He was fairly certain she'd made it through 3-hour parties without ever venturing beyond words of a single syllable, but when Penelope was in the company of someone with whom she felt comfortable, and Colin realized that he was probably privileged to count himself among that number, she had a dry wit, a sly smile, and evidence of a very intelligent mind, indeed. He wasn't surprised that she'd never attracted any serious suitors for her hand. She wasn't a beauty by any stretch, although upon close examination she was more attractive than he'd remembered her to be. Her brown hair had a touch of red to it, highlighted nicely by the nickering candles, and her skin was quite lovely, that perfect peaches and cream complexion that ladies were always slathering their faces with arsenic to achieve. But Penelope's attractiveness wasn't the sort that men usually noticed. And her normally shy and occasionally even stuttering demeanor didn't exactly showcase her personality. Still, it was too bad about her lack of popularity. She would have made someone a perfectly good wife. So you're saying, he mused, steering his mind back to the matter at hand, that I should consider a life of crime? Nothing of the sort, she replied, a demure smile on her face. Just that I rather suspect you could talk your way out of anything. And then, unexpectedly, her mien grew serious, and she quietly said, I envy that. Colin surprised himself by holding out his hand and saying, Penelope Featherington, I think you should dance with me. And then Penelope surprised him by laughing and saying, That's very sweet of you to ask, but you don't have to dance with me any longer. His pride felt oddly pricked. What the devil do you mean by that? She shrugged. It's official now. I'm a spinster. There's no longer a reason to dance with me just so that I don't feel left out. That's not why I danced with you, he protested, but he knew that it was exactly the reason. And half the time he'd only remembered to ask because his mother had poked him, hard, in the back and reminded him. She gave him a faintly pitying look, which galled him, because he'd never thought to be pitied by Penelope Featherington. If you think, he said, feeling his spine grow stiff, that I'm going to allow you to wiggle out of a dance with me now, you're quite delusional. You don't have to dance with me just to prove you don't mind doing it, she said. I want to dance with you, he fairly growled. Very well, she said, after what seemed to be a ridiculously long pause. It would surely be churlish for me to refuse. It was probably churlish of you to doubt my intentions, he said as he took her arm, but I'm willing to forgive you if you can forgive yourself. She stumbled, which made him smile. I do believe I'll manage, she choked out. Excellent. He offered her a bland smile. I'd hate to think of you living with the guilt. The music was just beginning, so Penelope took his hand and curtsied as they began the minuet. It was difficult to talk during the dance, which gave Penelope a few moments to catch her breath and gather her thoughts. Perhaps she'd been a bit too harsh with Colin. She shouldn't have scolded him for asking her to dance, when the truth was, those dances were among her most cherished memories. Did it really matter if he'd only done it out of pity? It would have been worse if he'd never asked her at all. She grimaced. Worse still, did this mean she had to apologize? Was something wrong with that éclair? Colin inquired the next time they stepped toward each other. A full 10 seconds passed before they were close enough again for her to say, I beg your pardon? You look as if you've swallowed something vile, he said, loudly this time, for he'd clearly lost patience with waiting for the dance to allow them to speak. Several people looked over, then stepped discreetly away, as if Penelope might actually be sick right there on the ballroom floor. Do you need to shout it to the entire world? Penelope hissed. You know, he said thoughtfully, bending into an elegant bow as the music drew to a close, that was the loudest whisper I've ever heard. He was insufferable, but Penelope wasn't going to say so, because it would only make her sound like a character in a very bad romantic novel. She'd read one just the other day in which the heroine used the word, or one of its synonyms, on every other page. Thank you for the dance, she said, once they'd reached the perimeter of the room. She almost added, you can now tell your mother that you've fulfilled your obligations, but immediately regretted her impulse. Colin hadn't done anything to deserve such sarcasm. It wasn't his fault that men only danced with her when forced to by their mothers. He'd always at least smiled and laughed while doing his duty, which was more than she could say for the rest of the male population. He nodded politely and murmured his own thanks. They were just about to part ways when they heard a loud female voice bark out, Mr. Bridgerton. They both froze. It was a voice they both knew. It was a voice everyone knew. Save me, Colin groaned. Penelope looked over her shoulder to see the infamous Lady Danbury pushing her way through the crowd, wincing when her ever-present cane landed on the foot of some hapless young lady. Maybe she means a different Mr. Bridgerton? Penelope suggested. There are quite a few of you, after all, and it's possible. I'll give you £10 if you don't leave my side, Colin blurted out. Penelope choked on air. Don't be silly, 20. Done, she said with a smile, not because she particularly needed the money but rather because it was strangely enjoyable to be extorting it from Colin. Lady Danbury, she called out, hurrying to the elderly lady's side. How nice to see you. Nobody ever thinks it's nice to see me, Lady Danbury said sharply, except maybe my nephew, and half the time I'm not even sure about him. But I thank you for lying all the same. Colin said nothing, but she still turned in his direction and swatted his leg with her cane. Good choice dancing with this one, she said. I've always liked her. More brains than the rest of her family put together. Penelope opened her mouth to defend at least her younger sister, when Lady Danbury barked out, "Ha," after barely a second's pause, adding, I noticed neither of you contradicted me. It is always a delight to see you, Lady Danbury, Colin said, giving her just the sort of smile he might have directed at an opera singer. Glib, this one is, Lady Danbury said to Penelope. You'll have to watch out for him. It is rarely necessary that I do so, Penelope said, as he is most often out of the country. See? Lady Danbury crowed again. I told you she was bright. You'll notice, Colin said smoothly, that I did not contradict you. The old lady smiled approvingly. So you didn't. You're getting smart in your old age, Mr. Bridgerton. It has occasionally been remarked that I possessed a small modicum of intelligence in my youth, as well. Oomph. The important word in that sentence being small, of course. Colin looked at Penelope through narrowed eyes. She appeared to be choking on laughter. We women must look out for one another, Lady Danbury said to no one in particular, since it is clear that no one else will do so. Colin decided it was definitely time to go. I think I see my mother. Escape is impossible, Lady Danbury crowed. Don't bother to attempt it, and besides, I know for a fact you don't see your mother. She's attending to some brainless twit who tore the hem off her dress. She turned to Penelope, who was now exerting such effort to control her laughter that her eyes were glistening with unshed tears. How much did he pay you not to leave him alone with me? Penelope quite simply exploded. I beg your pardon, she gasped, clasping a hand over her horrified mouth. Oh, no, go right ahead, Colin said expansively. You've been such a help already. You don't have to give me the £20, she said. I wasn't planning to. Only £20? Lady Danbury asked. Oomph. I would have thought I'd be worth at least 25. Colin shrugged. I'm a third son. Perpetually short of funds, I'm afraid. Ha, you're as plump in the pocket as at least 3 earls, Lady Danbury said. Well, maybe not earls, she added, after a bit of thought. But a few viscounts, and most barons, to be sure. Colin smiled blandly. Isn't it considered impolite to talk about money in mixed company? Lady Danbury let out a noise that was either a wheeze or a giggle, Colin wasn't sure which, then said, It's always impolite to talk about money, mixed company or no, but when one is my age, one can do almost anything one pleases. I do wonder, Penelope mused, what one can't do at your age. Lady Danbury turned to her. I beg your pardon? You said that one could do almost anything one pleases. Lady Danbury stared at her in disbelief, then cracked a smile. Colin realized he was smiling as well. I like her, Lady D said to him, pointing at Penelope as if she were some sort of statue for sale. Did I tell you I like her? I believe you did, he murmured. Lady Danbury turned to Penelope and said, her face a mask of utter seriousness, I do believe I couldn't get away with murder, but that might be all. All at once, both Penelope and Colin burst out laughing. Eh? Lady Danbury said. What's so funny? Nothing, Penelope gasped. As for Colin, he couldn't even manage that much. It's not nothing, Lady D persisted. And I shall remain here and pester you all night until you tell me what it is. Trust me when I tell you that that is not your desired course of action. Penelope wiped a tear from her eye. I just got through telling him, she said, motioning with her head toward Colin, that he probably could get away with murder. Did you, now? Lady Danbury mused, tapping her cane lightly against the floor, the way someone else might scratch her chin while pondering a deep question. Do you know, but I think you might be right. A more charming man I don't think London has ever seen. Colin raised a brow. Now, why don't I think you meant that as a compliment, Lady Danbury? Of course it's a compliment, you dunderhead. Colin turned to Penelope. As opposed to that, which was clearly a compliment. Lady Danbury beamed. I declare, she said, or in all truth, declared, this is the most fun I've had all season. Happy to oblige, Colin said with an easy smile. It's been an especially dull year, don't you think? Lady Danbury asked Penelope. Penelope nodded. Last year was a bit tedious as well. But not as bad as this year, Lady D persisted. Don't ask me, Colin said affably. I've been out of the country. Oomph. I suppose you're going to say that your absence is the reason we've all been so bored. I would never dream of it, Colin said with a disarming smile. But clearly, if the thought has crossed your mind, it must have some merit. Oomph, whatever the case, I am bored. Colin looked over at Penelope, who appeared to be holding herself very, very still, presumably to stave off laughter. Heywood. Lady Danbury suddenly called out, waving over a middle-aged gentleman. Wouldn't you agree with me? A vaguely panicked expression drifted across Lord Heywood's face, and then, when it became clear that he could not escape, he said, I try to make a policy of always agreeing with you. Lady Danbury turned to Penelope and said, is it my imagination, or are men getting more sensible? Penelope's only answer was a non-committal shrug. Colin decided she was a wise girl, indeed. Heywood cleared his throat, his blue eyes blinking fast and furious in his rather fleshy face. What, precisely, am I agreeing to? That the season is boring, Penelope supplied helpfully. Ah, Miss Featherington, Heywood said in a blustery sort of voice. Didn't see you there. Colin stole just enough of a glance at Penelope to see her lips straighten into a small, frustrated smile. Right here next to you, she muttered. So you are, Heywood said jovially, and yes, the season is dreadfully boring. Did someone say the season is dull? Colin glanced to his right. Another man and two ladies had just joined the group and were avidly expressing their agreement. Tedious, one of them murmured. Appallingly tedious. I have never attended a more banal round of parties, one of the ladies announced with an affected sigh. I shall have to inform my mother, Colin said tightly. He was among the most easygoing of men, but really, there were some insults he could not let pass. Oh, not this gathering, the woman hastened to add. This ball is truly the only shining light in an otherwise dark and dismal string of gatherings. Why, I was just saying to. Stop now, Lady Danbury ordered, before you choke on your foot. The lady quickly silenced herself. It's odd, Penelope murmured. Oh, Miss Featherington, said the lady who'd previously been going on about dark and dismal gatherings. Didn't see you there. What's odd? Colin asked, before anyone else could tell Penelope how unremarkable they found her. She gave him a small, grateful smile before explaining herself. It's odd how the ton seems to entertain themselves by pointing out how unentertained they are. I beg your pardon? Heywood said, looking confused. Penelope shrugged. I think the lot of you are having a jolly good time talking about how bored you are, that's all. Her comment was met with silence. Lord Heywood continued to look confused, and one of the two ladies must have had a speck of dust in her eye, because she couldn't seem to do anything but blink. Colin couldn't help but smile. He hadn't thought Penelope's statement was such a terribly complicated concept. The only interesting thing to do is read Whistledown, said the non-blinking lady, as if Penelope had never even spoken. The gentleman next to her murmured his assent. And then Lady Danbury began to smile. Colin grew alarmed. The old lady had a look in her eye. A frightening look. "I have an idea," she said. Someone gasped. Someone else groaned. "A brilliant idea." "Not that any of your ideas are anything but," Colin murmured. In his most affable voice, Lady Danbury shushed him with a wave of her hand. "How many great mysteries are there in life, really?" No one answered, so Colin guessed, 42? She didn't even bother to scowl at him. "I am telling you all here and now." Everyone leaned in. Even Colin. It was impossible not to indulge the drama of the moment. "You are all my witnesses." Colin thought he heard Penelope mutter, "Get on with it." £1,000, Lady Danbury said. The crowd surrounding her grew. £1,000, she repeated, her voice growing in volume. Really, she would have been a natural on the stage. £1,000. It seemed the entire ballroom had hushed into reverent silence. To the person who unmasks Lady Whistledown. Chapter 3. This author would be remiss if it was not mentioned that the most talked about moment at last night's birthday ball at Bridgerton House was not the rousing toast to Lady Bridgerton, age not to be revealed, but rather Lady Danbury's impertinent offer of £1,000 to whomever unmasks me. Do your worst, ladies and gentlemen of the ton. You haven't a prayer of solving this mystery. Lady Whistledown Society Papers, April 12, 1824. Precisely 3 minutes were required for news of Lady Danbury's outrageous dare to spread throughout the ballroom. Penelope knew this to be true because she happened to be facing a large, and, according to Kate Bridgerton, extremely precise, grandfather clock when Lady Danbury made her announcement. At the words, £1,000 to the person who unmasks Lady Whistledown, the clock read 44 minutes past 10. The long hand had advanced no farther than 47 when Nigel Berbrook stumbled into the rapidly growing circle of people surrounding Lady Danbury and proclaimed her latest scheme, "Scrumbly good fun." And if Nigel had heard about it, that meant everyone had, because Penelope's brother-in-law was not known for his intelligence, his attention span, or his listening ability. Nor, Penelope thought wryly, for his vocabulary. Scrumbly, indeed. "And who do you think Lady Whistledown is?" Lady Danbury asked Nigel. "No earthly idea," he admitted. "Ain't me, that's all I know." "I think we all know that," Lady D replied. "Who do you think it is?" Penelope asked Colin. He offered her a one-shouldered shrug. "I've been out of town too often to speculate." "Don't be silly," Penelope said. "Your cumulative time in London certainly adds up to enough parties and routs to form a few theories." But he just shook his head. "I really couldn't say." Penelope stared at him for a moment longer than was necessary, or, in all honesty, socially acceptable. There was something odd in Colin's eyes. Something fleeting and elusive. The ton often thought him nothing more than a devil-may-care charmer, but he was far more intelligent than he let on, and she'd have bet her life that he had a few suspicions. But for some reason, he wasn't willing to share them with her. "Who do you think it is?" Colin asked, avoiding her question with one of his own. "You've been out in society just about as long as Lady Whistledown. Surely you must have thought about it." Penelope looked about the ballroom, her eyes resting on this person and that, before finally returning to the small crowd around her. "I think it could very well be Lady Danbury," she replied. "Wouldn't that be a clever joke on everyone?" Colin looked over at the elderly lady, who was having a grand old time talking up her latest scheme. She was thumping her cane on the ground, chattering animatedly, and smiling like a cat with cream, fish, and an entire roast turkey. "It makes sense," he said thoughtfully, in a rather perverse sort of way. Penelope felt the corners of her mouth twist. She's nothing if not perverse. She watched Colin watching Lady D for another few seconds, then quietly said, "But you don't think it's her?" Colin slowly turned his head to face her, raising one brow in silent question. "I can tell by the expression on your face," Penelope explained. He grinned, that loose easy grin he so often used in public, "and here I thought I was inscrutable." "Afraid not," she replied. "Not to me, anyway." Colin sighed. "I fear it will never be my destiny to be a dark, brooding hero." "You may well find yourself someone's hero," Penelope allowed. "There's time for you yet." "But dark and brooding?" She smiled. "Not very likely." "Too bad for me," he said jauntily, giving her another one of his well-known smiles, this one the lopsided, boyish one. "The dark, brooding types get all the women." Penelope coughed discreetly, a bit surprised he'd be speaking of such things with her, not to mention the fact that Colin Bridgerton had never had trouble attracting women. He was grinning at her, awaiting a response, and she was trying to decide whether the correct reaction was polite maidenly outrage or a laugh and an "I'm such a good sport" sort of chuckle, when Eloise quite literally skidded to a halt in front of them. "Did you hear the news?" Eloise asked breathlessly. "Were you running?" Penelope returned. "Truly a remarkable feat in such a crowded ballroom. Lady Danbury has offered £1,000 to whomever unmasks Lady Whistledown." "We know," Colin said in that vaguely superior tone exclusive to older brothers. Eloise let out a disappointed sigh. "You do?" Colin motioned to Lady Danbury, who was still a scant few yards away. "We were right here when it happened." Eloise looked annoyed in the extreme, and Penelope knew exactly what she was thinking, and would most probably relate to her the following afternoon. It was one thing to miss an important moment. It was another entirely to discover that one's brother had seen the entire thing. "Well, people are already talking about it," Eloise said. "Gushing, really? I haven't been witness to such excitement in years." Colin turned to Penelope and murmured, "This is why I so often choose to leave the country." Penelope tried not to smile. "I know you're talking about me, and I don't care," Eloise continued, barely pausing to take a breath. "I tell you, the ton has gone mad. Everyone, and I mean everyone, is speculating on her identity, although the shrewdest ones won't say a word. Don't want others to win on their hunch, don't you know? I think," Colin announced, "that I am not so in need of £1,000 that I care to worry about this." "It's a lot of money," Penelope said thoughtfully. He turned to her in disbelief. "Don't tell me you're going to join in this ridiculous game." She cocked her head to the side, lifting her chin in what she hoped was an enigmatic, or if not enigmatic, at the very least slightly mysterious, manner. "I am not so well heeled that I can ignore the offer of £1,000, she said. "Perhaps if we work together," Eloise suggested. "God save me," was Colin's reply. Eloise ignored him, saying to Penelope, "We could split the money." Penelope opened her mouth to reply, but Lady Danbury's cane suddenly came into view, waving wildly through the air. Colin had to take a quick step to the side just to avoid getting his ear clipped off. "Miss Featherington," Lady D boomed. "You haven't told me who you suspect." "No, Penelope," Colin said, a rather smirky smile on his face, "you haven't." Penelope's first instinct was to mumble something under her breath and hope that Lady Danbury's age had left her hard enough of hearing that she would assume that any lack of understanding was the fault of her own ears and not Penelope's lips. But even without glancing to her side, she could feel Colin's presence, sense his quirky, cocky grin egging her on, and she found herself standing a little straighter, with her chin perched just a little higher than usual. He made her more confident, more daring. He made her more, herself. Or at least the herself she wished she could be. "Actually," Penelope said, looking Lady Danbury almost in the eye, "I think it's you." A collective gasp echoed around them. And for the first time in her life, Penelope Featherington found herself at the very center of attention. Lady Danbury stared at her, her pale blue eyes shrewd and assessing. And then the most amazing thing happened. Her lips began to twitch at the corners. Then they widened until Penelope realized she was not just smiling, but positively grinning. "I like you, Penelope Featherington," Lady Danbury said, tapping her right on the toe with her cane. "I wager half the ballroom is of the same notion, but no one else has the mettle to tell me so." "I really don't either," Penelope admitted, grunting slightly as Colin elbowed her in the ribs. "Obviously," Lady Danbury said with a strange light in her eyes, "you do." Penelope didn't know what to say to this. She looked at Colin, who was smiling at her encouragingly, then she looked back to Lady Danbury, who looked almost maternal. Which had to be the strangest thing of all. Penelope rather doubted that Lady Danbury had given maternal looks to her own children. "Isn't it nice," the older lady said, leaning in so that only Penelope could hear her words, "to discover that we're not exactly what we thought we were?" And then she walked away, leaving Penelope wondering if maybe she wasn't quite what she'd thought she was. Maybe, just maybe, she was something a little bit more. Star. The next day was a Monday, which meant that Penelope took tea with the Bridgerton ladies at number 5. She didn't know when, precisely, she'd fallen into that habit, but it had been so for close to a decade, and if she didn't show up on a Monday afternoon, she rather thought Lady Bridgerton would send someone over to fetch her. Penelope rather enjoyed the Bridgerton custom of tea and his quits in the afternoon. It wasn't a widespread ritual, indeed, Penelope knew of no one else who made a daily habit of it. But Lady Bridgerton insisted that she simply could not last from luncheon to supper, especially not when they were observing town hours and eating so late at night. And thus, every afternoon at 4, she and any number of her children, and often a friend or two, met in the informal upstairs drawing room for a snack. There was drizzle in the air, even though it was a fairly warm day, so Penelope took her black parasol with her for the short walk over to number 5. It was a route she'd followed hundreds of times before, a few houses down to the corner of Mount and Davies Street, then along the edge of Berkeley Square to Bruton Street. But she was in an odd mood that day, a little bit light-hearted and maybe even a little bit childish, so she decided to cut across the northern corner of the Berkeley Square Green for no other reason than she liked the squishy sound her boots made on the wet grass. It was Lady Danbury's fault. It had to be. She'd been positively giddy since their encounter the night before. Not what I thought I was, she sang to herself as she walked, adding a word every time the soles of her boots sank into the ground. Something more. Something more. She reached a particularly wet patch and moved like a skater on the grass, singing softly. Of course, she hadn't changed so much from the night before that she actually wanted someone to hear her singing in public, something more, as she slid forward. Which was, of course, since it was fairly well established, in her own mind, at least, that she had the worst timing in the history of civilization, right when she heard a male voice call out her name. She skidded to a halt and gave fervent thanks that she caught her balance at the very last moment instead of landing on her bottom on the wet and messy grass. It was, of course, him. "Colin," she said in a slightly embarrassed voice, holding still as she waited for him to reach her side. What a surprise. He looked like he was trying not to smile. "Were you dancing?" "Dancing?" she echoed. "It looked like you were dancing." "Oh. No." She swallowed guiltily, because even though she wasn't technically lying, it felt as if she were. "Of course not." His eyes crinkled slightly at the comers. "Pity, then. I would have felt compelled to partner you, and I've never danced in Berkeley Square." If he'd said the same to her just 2 days earlier, she would have laughed at his joke and let him be the witty and charming one. But she must have heard Lady Danbury's voice at the back of her head again, because she suddenly decided she didn't want to be the same old Penelope Featherington. She decided to join in the fun. She smiled a smile she didn't think she'd even known how to smile. It was wicked and she was mysterious, and she knew it wasn't all in her head because Colin's eyes widened markedly as she murmured, "That's a shame." "It's rather enjoyable." "Penelope Featherington," he drawled, "I thought you said you weren't dancing." She shrugged. "I lied." "If that's the case," he said, "then surely this must be my dance." Penelope's insides suddenly felt very queer. This was why she shouldn't let whispers from Lady Danbury go to her head. She might manage daring and charm for a fleeting moment, but she had no idea how to follow through. Unlike Colin, obviously, who was grinning devilishly as he held his arms out in perfect waltz position. "Colin," she gasped, "we're in Berkeley Square." "I know. I just finished telling you I've never danced here, don't you recall?" "But..." Colin crossed his arms. "TSK, TSK. You can't issue a dare like that and then try to weasel out of it. Besides, dancing in Berkeley Square seems like the sort of thing a person ought to do at least once in his life, wouldn't you agree?" "Anyone might see," she whispered urgently. He shrugged, trying to hide the fact that he was rather entertained by her reaction. "I don't care." "Do you?" Her cheeks grew pink, then red, and it seemed to take her a great deal of effort to form the words, "People will think you are courting me." He watched her closely, not understanding why she was disturbed. Who cared if people thought they were courting? The rumor would soon be proven false, and they'd have a good laugh at society's expense. It was on the tip of his tongue to say, "Hang society," but he held silent. There was something lurking deep in the brown depths of her eyes, some emotion he couldn't even begin to identify. An emotion he suspected he'd never even felt. And he realized that the last thing he wanted to do was hurt Penelope Featherington. She was his sister's best friend, and moreover, she was, plain and simple, a very nice girl. He frowned. He supposed he shouldn't be calling her a girl anymore. At 28, she was no more a girl than he was still a boy at 33. Finally, with great care and what he hoped was a good dose of sensitivity, he asked, "Is there a reason why we should worry if people think we are courting?" She closed her eyes, and for a moment Colin actually thought she might be in pain. When she opened them, her gaze was almost bittersweet. "It would be very funny, actually," she said. "At first." He said nothing, just waited for her to continue. "But eventually it would become apparent that we are not actually courting, and it would." She stopped, swallowed, and Colin realized that she was not as composed on the inside as she hoped to appear. "It would be assumed," she continued, "that you were the one to break things off, because, well, it just would be." He didn't argue with her. He knew that her words were true. She let out a sad-sounding exhale. "I don't want to subject myself to that. Even Lady Whistledown would probably write about it." How could she not? It would be far too juicy a piece of gossip for her to resist. "I'm sorry, Penelope," Colin said. He wasn't sure what he was apologizing for, but it still seemed like the right thing to say. She acknowledged him with a tiny nod. "I know I shouldn't care what other people say, but I do." He found himself turning slightly away as he considered her words. Or maybe he was considering the tone of her voice. Or maybe both. He'd always thought of himself as somewhat above society. Not really outside of it, precisely, since he certainly moved within it and usually enjoyed himself quite a bit. But he'd always assumed that his happiness did not depend upon the opinions of others, but maybe he wasn't thinking about this the right way. It was easy to assume that you didn't care about the opinions of others when those opinions were consistently favorable. Would he be so quick to dismiss the rest of society if they treated him the way they treated Penelope? She'd never been ostracized, never been made the subject of scandal. She just hadn't been popular. Oh, people were polite, and the Bridgertons had all befriended her, but most of Colin's memories of Penelope involved her standing at the perimeter of a ballroom, trying to look anywhere but at the dancing couples, clearly pretending that she really didn't want to dance. That was usually when he went over and asked her himself. She always looked grateful for the request, but also a little bit embarrassed, because they both knew he was doing it at least a little bit because he felt sorry for her. Colin tried to put himself in her shoes. It wasn't easy. He'd always been popular, his friends had looked up to him at school and the women had flocked to his side when he'd entered society, and as much as he could say he didn't care what people thought, when it came right down to it, he rather liked being liked. Suddenly he didn't know what to say. Which was strange, because he always knew what to say. In fact, he was somewhat famous for always knowing what to say. It was, he reflected, probably one of the reasons he was so well liked. But he sensed that Penelope's feelings depended on his next words, and at some point in the last 10 minutes, her feelings had become very important to him. "You're right," he finally said, deciding that it was always a good idea to tell someone she was correct. "It was very insensitive of me. Perhaps we should start anew?" She blinked. "I beg your pardon?" He waved his hand about, as if the motion could explain everything. "Make a fresh start." She looked quite adorably confused, which confused him, since he'd never thought Penelope the least bit adorable. "But we've known each other for 12 years, she said. "Has it really been that long?" He searched his brain, but for the life of him, he couldn't recall the event of their first meeting. "Never mind that. I meant just for this afternoon, you ninny." She smiled, clearly in spite of herself, and he knew that calling her a ninny had been the exact right thing to do, although in all truth he had no idea why. "Here we go," he said slowly, drawing his words out with a long flourish of his arm. "You are walking across Berkeley Square, and you spy me in the distance. I call out your name and you reply by saying—" Penelope caught her lower lip between her teeth, trying, for some unknown reason, to contain her smile. What magical star had Colin been born under, that he always knew what to say? He was the Pied Piper, leaving nothing but happy hearts and smiling faces in his wake. Penelope would have bet money, far more than the £1,000 Lady Danbury had offered up, that she was not the only woman in London desperately in love with the third Bridgerton. He dipped his head to the side and then righted it in a prompting sort of motion. "I would reply," Penelope said slowly. "I would reply." Colin waited 2 seconds, then said, "Really, any words will do." Penelope had planned to fix a bright grin on her face, but she discovered that the smile on her lips was quite genuine. "Colin," she said, trying to sound as if she'd just been surprised by his arrival. "What are you doing about?" "Excellent reply," he said. She shook her finger at him. "You're breaking out of character." Yes, of course. "Apologies." He paused, blinked twice, then said, "Here we are. How about this, much the same as you, I imagine. Heading to number 5 for tea." Penelope found herself falling into the rhythm of the conversation. "You sound as if you're just going for a visit. Don't you live there?" He grimaced. "Hopefully just for the next week. A fortnight at most. I'm trying to find a new place to live. I had to give up the lease on my old set of rooms when I left for Cyprus, and I haven't found a suitable replacement yet. I had a bit of business down on Piccadilly and thought I'd walk back." "In the rain?" He shrugged. "It wasn't raining when I left earlier this morning. And even now it's just drizzle." Just drizzle, Penelope thought. Drizzle that clung to his obscenely long eyelashes, framing eyes of such perfect green that more than one young lady had been moved to write, extremely bad, poetry about them. Even Penelope, level-headed as she liked to think herself, had spent many a night in bed, staring at the ceiling and seeing nothing but those eyes. Just drizzle, indeed. "Penelope?" She snapped to attention. "Right. Yes. I'm going to your mother's for tea as well. I do so every Monday. And often on other days, too," she admitted. "When there's, nothing interesting occurring at my house. No need to sound so guilty about it. My mother's a lovely woman. If she wants you over for tea, you should go." Penelope had a bad habit of trying to hear between the lines of people's conversations, and she had a suspicion that Colin was really saying that he didn't blame her if she wanted to escape her own mother from time to time. Which somehow, unaccountably, made her feel a little sad. He rocked on his heels for a moment, then said, "Well, I shouldn't keep you out here in the rain." She smiled, since they'd been standing outside for at least 15 minutes. Still, if he wanted to continue with the ruse, she would do so as well. "I'm the one with the parasol," she pointed out. His lips curved slightly. "So you are. But still, I wouldn't be much of a gentleman if I didn't steer you toward a more hospitable environment. Speaking of which..." He frowned, looking around. "Speaking of what?" "Of being a gentleman. I believe we're supposed to see to the welfare of ladies." "And?" He crossed his arms. "Shouldn't you have a maid with you?" "I live just around the corner," she said, a little bit deflated that he didn't remember that. She and her sister were best friends with two of his sisters, after all. He'd even walked her home once or twice. "On Mount Street," she added, when his frown did not dissipate. He squinted slightly, looking in the direction of Mount Street, although she had no idea what he hoped to accomplish by doing so. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Colin. It's just near the corner of Davies Street. It can't be more than a 5-minute walk to your mother's." "4, if I'm feeling exceptionally sprightly. I was just looking to see if there were any darkened or recessed spots." He turned back to face her. "Where a criminal might lurk." "In Mayfair?" "In Mayfair," he said grimly. "I really think you ought to have a maid accompany you when you journey to and fro. I should hate for something to happen to you." She was oddly touched by his concern, even though she knew he would have extended equal thoughtfulness to just about every female of his acquaintance. That was simply the sort of man he was. "I can assure you that I observe all of the usual proprieties when I am traveling longer distances," she said. "But truly, this is so close. Just a few blocks, really. Even my mother doesn't mind." Colin's jaw suddenly looked quite stiff. "Not to mention," Penelope added, "that I am 28. What has that to do with anything?" "I am 33, if you care to know." She knew that, of course, since she knew almost everything about him. "Colin," she said, a slightly annoyed whine creeping into her voice. "Penelope," he replied, in exactly the same tone. She let out a long exhale before saying, "I am quite firmly on the shelf, Colin. I needn't worry about all of the rules that plagued me when I was 17. I hardly think." One of Penelope's hands planted itself on her hip. "Ask your sister if you don't believe me." He suddenly looked more serious than she had ever seen him. "I make it a point not to ask my sister on matters that relate to common sense." "Colin!" Penelope exclaimed. "That's a terrible thing to say. I didn't say I don't love her. I didn't even say I don't like her. I adore Eloise, as you well know. However." "Anything that begins with however has got to be bad," Penelope muttered. "Eloise," he said with uncharacteristic high-handedness, "should be married by now." Now, that was really too much, especially in that tone of voice. "Some might say," Penelope returned with a self-righteous little tilt of her chin, "that you should be married by now, too." "Oh, pie. You are, as you so proudly informed me, 33. His expression was slightly amused, but with that pale tinge of irritation which told her he would not remain amused for long. "Penelope, don't even." "Ancient," she chirped. He swore under his breath, which surprised her, since she didn't think she'd ever heard him do so in the presence of a lady. She probably should have taken it as a warning, but she was too riled up. She supposed the old saying was true, courage spawned more courage. Or maybe it was more that recklessness emboldened more recklessness, because she just looked at him archly and said, "Weren't both of your older brothers married by the age of 30? To her surprise, Colin merely smiled and crossed his arms as he leaned one shoulder against the tree they were standing beneath. "My brothers and I are very different men." It was, Penelope realized, a very telling statement, because so many members of the ton, including the fabled Lady Whistledown, made so much of the fact that the Bridgerton brothers looked so alike. Some had even gone so far as to call them interchangeable. Penelope hadn't thought any of them were bothered by this. In fact, she'd assumed they'd all felt flattered by the comparison, since they seemed to like each other so well, but maybe she was wrong. Or maybe she'd never looked closely enough. Which was rather strange, because she felt as if she'd spent half her life watching Colin Bridgerton. One thing she did know, however, and should have remembered, was that if Colin had any sort of a temper, he had never chosen to let her see it. Surely she'd flattered herself when she thought that her little quip about his brothers marrying before they turned 30 might set him off. No, his method of attack was a lazy smile, a well-timed joke. If Colin ever lost his temper. Penelope shook her head slightly, unable even to fathom it. Colin would never lose his temper. At least not in front of her. He'd have to be really, truly, no, profoundly, upset to lose his temper. And that kind of fury could only be sparked by someone you really, truly, profoundly cared about. Colin liked her well enough, maybe even better than he liked most people, but he didn't care. Not that way. Perhaps we should just agree to disagree, she finally said. On what? Air. She couldn't remember. On what a spinster may or may not do? He seemed amused by her hesitation. That would probably require that I defer to my younger sister's judgment in some capacity, which would be, as I'm sure you can imagine, very difficult for me. But you don't mind deferring to my judgment? His smile was lazy and wicked. Not if you promise not to tell another living soul. He didn't mean it, of course. And she knew he didn't mean it. But that was his way. Humor and a smile could smooth any path. And blast him, it worked, because she heard herself sighing and felt herself smiling, and before she knew it she was saying, enough.